Thank you.
Great. So over to you.
Thank you. So you know what we are going to do today. We are discussing Clare's form of life. And well, this you know. I am sure that all of you think this will be the most attractive afternoon because Clare's rule is the most attractive rule.
Sorry, Gert. Right.
I think Gerhard is on mute.
That's better. Thank you.
That's much better.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't see. I wasn't aware. No, well, I think you have an idea what I've been saying, so I'm not going to repeat it. There are a number of things that are interesting in Clare's rule. And the first is it's personal. She's talking as an I and as a we sometimes. Secondly, if you come from the other rules that we have seen, the rule of Ugolino and Innocent, it's a Franciscan rule, and that's a relief. Just as it is a relief, it's the one with last point, that it's not a list, an errant list of obligations and prohibitions, but that it's a list with history, autobiography in it. And if you look at the big old great rules like Benedict and St. Augustine and Basil, there's no autobiography in it. It's only what ought or ought not to be on. And this autobiography means it's in time and place and it's personal. And then, of course, it's the first rule that was written. It's not the first rule that was written by a woman, but it is the first rule that is written by a woman and approved by the Pope. If only you think of Agnes of Prague, who also tried to, she didn't try to write a rule, but she did try in vain to get it approved. And so you, without any doubt, will have your own reasons why you like Clare's rule. But when I started preparing this afternoon, I was really dazzled by the many hypotheses, misunderstandings, and mistakes that I saw in the English and American literature on the rule of Clare. And I have made a long list, but then I stopped, and I only mention now four points that I think is a misunderstanding. First one, the original papal bull of 1253 should not be the one that is kept in Santa Chiara in Asti. It should be, according to Ms. Knox, should be the rule of 2066. But it is its original rule. It's a misunderstanding. Then it's a misunderstanding that the Pope approved the rule of Clare only for San Damiano. We come to that. Or that he had his approval for the rest of the world. And it's also a misunderstanding that the rule of Clare did not have influence on the other rules, on the rule of Urban and the rule of Isabel. Now, if I would have taken all these misunderstandings and mistakes and the things, I mean, that I consider as such, it would have been a very stupid afternoon because I would have been busy with explaining why a misunderstanding is a misunderstanding. And so what I try to do is to be as positive as possible in the sense that I try to tell what is at stake and not what others have said that I don't like. At the end of the presentation, I will come back to exactly 3 of the 4 points that I mentioned now. And so we have the contents of today are simple as they were. We start with what preceded the approval of the Pope, then the whole question of the approval by Reinaldo, the Cardinal, and the confirmation by Innocent. I have the thesis, I can perhaps say that now. I have the thesis, I'm convinced that the important point is not Innocent's confirmation 2 days before Clare's death, although that I like it very much, you can weep about it. But the most important point for the Curia was the approval in 1252 by Cardinal Reinaldo in the name of the Pope. Then we come, and that's the main point for today, the contents of the rule, and then some final remarks. A number of you will know about the book of Catherine Mooney on Clare. Just let me pick it in a moment. It's this book, Clare of Assisi and the 13th century church, religious women, rules and resistance. It's really an interesting book in a number of ways. One of the things that I don't like is that she discussed at large some points like, is Clare the author of the rule? And she has all kind of possibilities, but the she didn't doubt it. But the good point of this is that she shows, not for the first time, that the rule of Clare is a rule with many voices. There are many voices in this rule, and my conclusion you will see here at the bottom of this page. Clare's rule is, I would say, a very interesting composition. It's the input of different people, but it is not a cacophony. It is a symphony with one conductor whose name is Clare, and she is really in the lead. But if you simply begin with the beginning, then you see that Clare herself says, this is the form of life which Francis instituted. The first sentence. And it makes it seem likely that Francis is the writer, or at least the inventor. For centuries, people have thought so. And you can see it on this page. I have a photo of the title page of Wadding's Opuscula, the writings of St. Francis. And he says quite clearly, A Sancto Francisco. So the first rule for the class is written by St. Francis. But St. Francis is not the only one who is talking. The rule is full of quotations from Francis, the later rule and the earlier rule, from Ugolino, Benedict, etc. As you can see in the Synossi Grammatico, the colored synopsis, and you see the second picture here. It gives all the sources for Clare's rule. Very interesting, but also very colored. There are many sources. In other chapters, Clare clearly speaks in her own voice. For instance, and just as I and my sisters have always been careful, there are more of this kind of things. So the I of Clare is really, really present. And I have always had the impression that it's the rule that she has composed is interesting in the many voices that can be heard. That are, first of all, the later rule of St. Francis. It's really the most important source. Clare changes his text only where the difference of lifestyle between friars and sisters make this necessary. Belonging to Francis and his spirituality is really absolutely essential for Clare. For the norms on enclosure and on the daily life, fasting and walking, so sleeping, she uses the rule of Ugolino. She avoids casuistry, and that's a learned word saying that she does not sum up all kind of possible cases. And she gives more space to the responsibility of the community. I must say that the rule of innocence is less important than the rule of Ugolino. If you know the name of Sister Chiara Augusta Lainati, she was an authority of the former generation, and she said for me for the first time that for Clare, innocence rule was really less important than the rule of Ugolino. Clare uses the rule of Saint Benedict selectively, and I have the impression that I'm not sure, but I have the impression that she knows quite well when she's selecting his rule. It's to give more authority, more weight to some points that are important to her. Finally, there are some other sources that are less important: the canon law, Saint Cialanus Remembrance, and the constitutions of the friars. Why did Clare start writing her form of life? We don't know. It is too easy to say the other rules were not good enough for her. I think that's true, but it's not necessarily the reason that she started. Probably it's better to say she wanted to teach others the inspiration she and her sisters had received from Francis and had developed in their own way in San Damiano. There were disadvantages in the rule of Ugolino. He wrote nothing about not having possessions, nothing about poverty. He did not bind together the friars and the sisters, and the norms for daily life were very strict. But I think the most problematic part is that Ugolino's rule and Innocent's rule did not open up perspective. They were commandments and prohibitions. Spirituality, direction, development was missing. They were clearly written outside the monastery by men without experience from within. But I repeat what I said at the beginning. We do not know if this was Clare's reason to start with a rule. It is relatively simple, I thought later, to say not from what point did she start, but what did she want to do in the end? What wanted she to be her legacy? That is what you can see in the rule. But you don't start, I think, you don't start a rule with your eye on posterity, on later generations. You start a rule because here and now, something has to be said, has to be discussed, has to be brought further. When did Clare write her rule? All scholars claim nowadays that Clare began with the rule after the failure of Innocent's rule. It's really, I can say it like that because both an Italian scholar, Giovanna Casagrande, and a German-speaking scholar, Nicholas Kuster, say everybody says Clare began when she didn't like Innocent's rule. So let's say 5 years before her death. Clare, however, declares that the form of life started with St. Francis. That's 36 years earlier. The introductory letters of Pope Innocent IV and Cardinal Reinaldo agree. This is the form of life that St. Francis has given. And I think that you have to take Clare seriously, in the sense that the rule was the product of 40 years of experience, of slowly writing, rewriting, discussing, gradually growing text of discussions and new insights. And in this 40 years, lifelong history, the draft of Agnes of Prague has its own place. That was, I think, we don't know what it is, so we have to guess. That was the rule of Clare and Agnes in its form in the 30s. I take a sip of water. But as you may remember, I have said 2 or 3 weeks ago that the sisters in San Damiano follow the rule of Ugolino. How can you combine these two things? It sounds as if I'm contradicting myself. I think there are two factors. The first is the difference between the rule of Ugolino and Clare's rule. It's more a difference in tone and perspective than in duties and norms. This is important point. Many prescriptions are more or less the same, but then in later development, maybe it started the same. Or in any case, they are comparable. But the rule of Ugolino is formulated from without with tones of distrust, whereas the rule of Clare is written from within the cloister in an atmosphere of trust and confidence. The second is experience. The sisters developed their skills, understood better what they wanted, accepted some things that were impossible, etc. Ugolino did not want to change his form of life, whereas Clare's rule was open for new insights. Slowly, the sisters grew out of the rule of Ugolino into the rule of Clare. It's an hypothesis, and I like it, but perhaps later we come to better insights. Here's the first part, the prehistory. Now the part of approval and confirmation. On 16 September 1252, Reinaldo approved Clare's rule in Perugia by the authority of the Lord Pope, as well as our own. According to Clare's legend, she had asked him for a paper confirmation of the privilege of poverty, by which she clearly meant the rule. Scholars often deny this. They say, one, that Clare asked for confirmation of the privilege of 1228, which she did not receive, and two, that the sources are silent about the confirmation of the rule. Sorry, there's something hindering me. Two, that the sources are silent about the confirmation of the rule. The solution I present here is the traditional one, and it solves a lot of questions and saves a lot of time. Did Reinaldo change the rule before approving it? We have to ask this question, as you have to ask that in any instance. It's logical when you go to a higher office that they want to have their say in it. So I'm not saying he did, but you have to discuss the possibility. If so, I'm not sure, then I think there are two points. The first one is that Clare and Agnes of Prague always avoided the word abbess, because it implies a position of power. The word abbess can, however, be found in the rule, possibly because Reinaldo insisted on the usual normal canonical terms. The second point is that on 4 points in the second and fourth chapter of a rule, the rule specifies details from canon law, of which I find it hard to believe that Clare wanted them mentioned, because it was normal law. It's just you can find it in the decretals of Gregory IX. That's the collection of canons that was the most important in that moment. It's nothing new, simply repetition. So I'm not saying that she did not do it, but if so, if you have to look for changes, then this is one that comes to my mind. Reinaldo's approbation was considered valid, as is shown by the so-called clausa or clausula regularitatis, the clause in the Privilegium Commune that describes, I will explain later, that describes the rule that the religious have to follow. I told you the first afternoon about the Privilegium Commune, a large privilege given for all kinds of religious monasteries or orders. And in this Privilegium Commune, that you only got when you had certain development, when the period of the beginning was over, there was a rule, there was a sentence, a part of a sentence, and that part of the sentence that Clauser described the rule that you had. So mostly it was Saint Benedict's rule, or it was the rule of Saint Augustine, or it was the rule of Basilius. Those three were most important. And if you check the development of the clausula regularitatis, that's of the description of the rule in the privilegium commune, then there's an interesting development in the privilegia for the poor class. The earliest formulation from 1229 to 1235 was the monastic order according to God and the rule of Saint Benedict. This was to this was added as part of the sentence in 1235, and the institution of the enclosed nuns of San Damiano in Assisi. Okay, that's what poor class are doing. They want to live, and they live like the sisters in San Damiano. That's what it says. But then in October 1252, a new element was added. And the form of life that our predecessor, Pope Gregory of happy memory, has given to you when he was still in the lower office. Why was that in October 1252? Well, you don't have to look for long to see what had happened. A month earlier, in September 1252, Cardinal Reinaldo had approved, in the name of the Pope, the new rule of Clare. And that meant that the rule of San Damiano was not anymore the same as the rule of all the other sisters. And so then they had to supplement it in this way. But now, if we want to know what was the status of the approval of Reinaldo, you have to say, look, apparently that was so important that this fixed formulas of the Curia had to be changed. And that means that this, when I discovered this, I thought this is a clear indication that the approval of Cardinal Reinaldo for the Curia, for the Pope, was more important than the later approval. A second argument for that is that I came across, and that I read again, I must say, the way in which Pope Urbanus gave consent to the poor class in Breslau, in Wrocław, in Poland, to live according to the rule of Saint Clare. You can read it at home if you understand Latin. You can read it quite simply. That's why I printed it here, copied it here. He gives permission to the nuns of Breslau to follow class rule, and his argument is because it was approved by Reinaldo in the name of the Pope. He didn't say because Pope Innocent on class deathbed approves or confirmed the approval. No, he says it's because Reinaldo approved it. You can see in red Alexander Papa, predecessor noster. Alexander Pope, that's the same as Reinaldo, predecessor, who was then Bishop of Ostia and Velletri, Dux approbandum, approved it. And this papal letter does not then give the text of the confirmation by Pope Innocent, but he gives the text of the Urkunde des Bischofs Reinald van Ostia. He gives the charter of Bishop Reinaldo. It means also for Urban, this was the approval by Reinaldo was more important than by the Pope Innocent. Okay, here we can see that class rule was not only approved for San Damiano, but also for Breslau, and that's important because I couldn't find, in the most literal sense, I couldn't find the charter for Prague, but we know that in the legend of Agnes, it says that the sisters started living according to Clare's rule after it was approved. And there must be a charter, but I could never find it on internet or in the library, etc. So there are two monasteries of which it's clear that they also followed Clare's rule in the 13th century. It's Prague and Breslau. Reinaldo's approval in 1252 was clearly sufficient for the Curia, but not for Clare, who longed for explicit papal approbation, as the process Sister Philippa exactly said. The Pope and the cardinals had a very high regard for Clare. The Curia lived in the monastery of San Francesco in Assisi from April to October 1253. They were at hand, so to say. The Pope visited Clare probably twice. Tradition says she then asked for the papal confirmation. It came 2 days before her death, the seal on her life. A note on the papal bull says that she kissed it many times. And then she died. So it's clear. For Clare, this papal confirmation was more important. She had been waiting for it really. The Pope's confirmation of Clare's rule has a form that some people find strange. What is the function of the letters of Pope Innocent and Cardinal Reinaldo? Kathleen Mooney's monography that I already have shown you sheds doubt on almost every aspect of the parchment. Bucher, however, is a normal example of the Curia's habit to include earlier documents that are part of the dossier or have to be confirmed into newer ones. And that, if you say that is an anachronism, is a consequence of the absence of photocopiers. That's of course nonsense, even say it like that. What I mean to say is this. We are so used to the availability of all kinds of documents, not only in Rome, but also on our computer or in our library, that we cannot really imagine what it meant that if you need a copy, then you simply have to write it yourself. And then there are different habits. And I'll show you later. I also found in other instances, it's really, no, don't let me elaborate the text too much. This habit makes this document look like a set of Russian dolls in dolls in dolls. The papal confirmation looks like this. It starts with the letter of information of Innocent IV. In it is inserted the Reinaldo's letter of approval of half a year earlier, in which is inserted Clare's rule from beginning to the end. But because it's an insertion, then it has to come back the letter of approval of Reinaldo that was not finished yet. And after that has to come the letter of confirmation of the Pope and the seal, which is lost. If you see it like this, I hope it's a bit understandable. In the edition of Sister Francis Teresa of Clare's letters, these last two parts, Reinaldo's and the Pope's, are lacking. And it has to do with, I suppose it has to do with our feeling, what are these things doing there? It's superfluous. We've had it. But from the way this kind of things is made, it's logical. To make this point, to stress this point in another way, exactly the same way of inserting documents can be found in the Privilegium Commune for Monteluce in Perugia. Also the others. It's really normal, but I use this one because I have edited it, and so I have a good photocopy of the original, on which I have been applying some colors. In blue is the text of the Privilegium. And you see it begins with it and it ends with it. In green is the letter of confirmation of the next text, the white text of September 1222, You see also twice, the beginning and end, and in the middle is Ugo's privilege of the monastery in July 1219. Here you see the lowest part that consists of the signatures of Pope and cardinals, because this is a solemn privilege. A simple privilege, like the rule of Clare or the privilege of Paupertatis, does not have these signatures. So a simple privilege and a solemn privilege are for the Curia fixed terms with a number of things that have to be done in a precise way. And if you know that, it helps to understand the way these things function. You understand it better, and so you're not surprised anymore that at the end some formulas come. In the documents itself, however, you cannot see really that the document is inserted visually. The beginning of a new document looks the same as the beginning of a new sentence. I have in red circumscribed que est talis or que talis est, and then comes the age of Honorius of the age of Ugo. You see? And this H's initial is not more important than the P on the bottom of the A on top at the beginning of new sentences. I have elaborated on this a bit because it was discussed in America recently, but also to show that knowing the habit, this kind of habit, helps in understanding what is at stake. And the same point is here. For whom was the rule of Clare approved? The Pope says quite clearly to Clare and the other sisters in the monastery of San Damiano in Assisi. So for them, the document was written. But most modern scholars, and I mean really the majority, conclude that the rule of Clare was only approved for San Damiano. And that is a mistake. And that mistake has to do with the absence of photocopiers, etc., printers. And I found that out when I edited the edition of the Rule of Ugolino. I have looked for 9 charters. 7 of them are simply addressed to one monastery and nothing more. Pamplona, Prague, Ascoli Piceno, Salamanca, Città della Pieve, Fulingen, and Gubbio. So if you argue, if you reason like this, the rule of Clare is done quite often, then you say the rule of Ugolino is only for Pamplona, that's the oldest. No, it's not the only for Pamplona. If you don't have a photocopy of it, then you can write one document at a time. So you can only write it for one monastery. And the other way around, if you write proudly on top of it to all the abbeys and monasteries of the whole order, that looks very good. And we, modern people, think that all these monasteries and all these abbeys automatically had received via post or via internet a copy of this document, as nowadays can happen. But it simply means that somebody at the Curia thought it can be sent to all those monasteries and abbeys, but he is not going to organize that because that's simply too much work. If you want to have it, then you have to ask for it, and then you get it. Last conclusion of this part. The bull for San Damiano was meant for San Damiano. If other monasteries asked for their own copy, they would receive one. So simple. And nothing with paper policy that is trying to hide the approval of San Damiano. The letter with the approval of Clare's rule was not registered. This is another point of this, what is important. In Rome, in the Vatican, there are registers of paper letters. And what, for instance, Jacques Dallarin in Durham recently has said is that all important letters are there. It's not true. According to the one whom I trust the most on this point, Under Innocent IV was only 50% of the letters recorded in the Vatican Register. Clare's canonization letter, Clare, Claris, Clare, cannot be found in the register. And that's what I find very odd. The rule of Ugolino was registered 25 years after its release in 1245. And so not in 1220. Probably because the procuratores of the Clares in Valladolid paid for it, not because the Curia thought about it. So what can be found in the Vatican registers is either because an impetrator, somebody who asked for the privilege, paid for it, or because the Curia thought it important. And the second is, why did the Curia thought it important? Quite often we don't know. And for instance, and especially the negative part, why could this not be found there? We don't know. That means that originally there was only one copy of this bull, and that copy was in Assisi. When the sisters were afraid that they had to go to obey a new rule, the rule of Urban, they went, or they sent, I suppose, they sent friars to the Curia, please renew the approbation of our rule. That is a normal procedure. If you're afraid, then you simply go there and ask, renew it. And if you paid for it, then you got the job. And that was the moment, according to Attilio Bartoli Langeli, that's the authority, that's the moment that somebody wrote on this paper letter, ad insta fiat est. Follow this little s, we don't know who s is, who is s. That ad insta fiat est formally was said, yeah, they were in a hurry, with the approval of Clare's rule, because Clare was dying. So on the concept, somebody should have written, follow this model, so make this model into an official document with all the characteristics of a simple privilege. But it was not on the draft that it was written, it was on the official charter, which is very illogical that you write it on the finished product and not on a copy. So Bartoli Langeli says in 1266, some representative of the sisters of Santa Clara went to Alvieto in this instance, and there they said, yeah, you get it. And clerk wrote on it, make this copy. So renew this copy ad insta fiat. This is the model that you have to follow. Later was the papal bull preserved among the relics of Clare, not on her grave, as a lot of people have said, it's thought. A copy was, among other things, made for Colette in 1410. And in the 19th century, there were photos of which every Clareson monastery received a copy. I think this is the moment to interrupt myself, and let's see if